Welcome back to the Octobleep podcast, and today's guest is very special. He's a influence of mine. I'd say probably a somebody I really look up to and has inspired a lot of my work because he has painstakingly revolutionized the way that I look at astrology, because he's reset it back to the natural way of doing things. And he is somebody who's really brought True Sky Astrology and True Sidereal into the modern astrological milieu. I'd love to present Athen Chimenti on the show today. Athen, how's it going today?
Not too bad, not too bad. Great to be here, David. Thanks so much for having me. It's been I think a long overdue episode, but I'm very happy to.
It really has. I mean, I heard whispers of you from some people I really look up to that got hot on sidereal astrology, and your name's come up a lot. And obviously I've used your website a lot. There was a point in time where I was on there probably 5 times a day, casting charts for people and looking at the math, and I downloaded the Prometheus software, and it was really the backbone of my own trifecta system. So in many ways, I think this is going to be a long overdue conversation. And I'd really love to know what brought you in your own journey to say, hey, I'm going to actually spend time and create True Sky Astrology or True Sidereal Astrology.
Yeah, so my journey came before astrology. Like, I was always sort of exposed to it. Like, I had an aunt that was really big into astrology, and I always found it fascinating. But I was always coming from a very left brain, very objective sort of view of life, at least for the bulk of like through my 20s. So, it's very much like if very scientific left brain. If you were going to approach me with astrology at that time, I probably would have been ready for a debate and debated on how it's BS or whatever. But I was always into personal development, and that was, I think, really the thing that made all this possible. It started with meditation, really. And as I started to meditate more, I was living in this homestead that was in Death Valley over there outside of, between Nevada and California there. And spent a lot of time internal, really getting deep into meditation, very far removed from society, and not that I knew it at the time, but being exposed to the stars like that. So I had a sort of spiritual awakening that was there in 2011, going into 2012, and that made 2012 a very spiritual year for me, as it was, I think, for a lot of us. But throughout that period, I started to get exposed to these different modalities, and astrology really stood out because it's still very grounded in my mind, like it's still very objective. Like, you can go outside and see the actual stars and really apply it very practically to one's life. Not that the other modalities aren't beneficial, but that was the one that really spoke to me, being more on that left side of the brain kind of thing. So I started with, really tropical, as most of us do, and knew about sidereal, of course, but it didn't really hit me until there was supposed to be this full moon in Gemini. And so I got my smartphone. This is right when these apps came out, where it was like, you can look at the sky with the phone. And, knowing about sidereal, and this is the point, it's like, even knowing about sidereal, which most astrologers do, obviously, it didn't really hit me until I saw it visually, because I'm over there ready to expect, because just going through the day-to-day motions unconsciously, ready to expect this full moon in Gemini, and that was right smack in the middle of Taurus. So when that happened, it really hit me hard, and I was like really questioning, like, what am I doing? And one thing led to the next, and I transitioned into regular sidereal, but then soon, of course, realized that even with regular sidereal, and by the way, in case anyone in the audience doesn't know, we have the tropical zodiac, which is the main Western astrology, which uses the seasons, but that deviates from the actual sky, which is why we use what's called sidereal, which does try to be as close to the actual sky as possible. But anyways, I was using mainstream sidereal, which uses these even 30 degrees for each of the signs. And of course, that wasn't good enough either, because you would have the same situation, especially like between Leo and Cancer. You got things saying in mainstream sidereal, it's in Leo, but it's actually in Cancer, or they would say it's Cancer, but it's actually in Leo. So anyways, I eventually got to the true sidereal world, and the only thing available was the IAU boundaries. So that's the International Astronomical Union. And these are the boundaries set by astronomers, not astrologers. And so they weren't concerned with seeing planetary positions in the zodiac, right? They weren't concerned with basically using the ecliptic, which is what we as astrologers do. Like when you look at an astrology chart, it's the ecliptic, which is the path of the sun and very closely the path of the planets. So their boundaries are not set to that. And that's unfortunate because once you go to well, in this case, really like a software like Prometheus, which is the one I use, even that one defaults into these IAU boundaries. Even the Wikipedia page on sidereal and true sidereal uses these IAU boundaries. So it's very unfortunate. But anyways, I had to create the boundaries myself. And so I created what I call the midpoint system, which is basically just keeping it very simple, taking the last star of one constellation and the first star of the next, and drawing the boundary halfway between the two. So this is, of course, a fluid system. It's meant to be using 3 degrees of variance. So anything within 2 signs should be considered a blend. But it's been extremely accurate and extremely helpful. So that's what I've been doing for the past roughly 12, 13 years. And here we are today with a really growing community and things really looking like they're on the uptrend with True Sidereal, which is, really a great thing to see, considering that we've gone so long, thousands of years not using the visible sky. I mean, mind you, in Hindu astrology in India, they've been quite true to it. And I always like to give respect there because even though their zodiac is an even 30 degrees, like I was saying with the mainstream sidereal, they do have a nakshatra system, which uses the actual stars. And so if you're using full-on Vedic, then you are using true sidereal. But anyways, in the West, at least, it's long overdue. And so something that I think really technology gave us, luckily, I think if it wasn't for the birth of the internet and if it wasn't for the ability to be able to create these planetariums of these astrology softwares that take into account precession or, the sidereal zodiac easily, then I don't think we would have this today. So I'm very grateful, very fortunate to be here. And I'm really happy that, people like you are out there too, sharing the same thing, and for you branching it even further out into like human design and gene keys and all this, because I think it's something that really is the future as far as I'm concerned.
The first time I went to your website, I liked how simple it was. It's like, basically the stars as you see them in the sky, right? Like that's what we're talking about here. So whenever people ask, what is true sky astrology? Or what is true sidereal astrology? That's the simple basis of it. And what I feel like in our ever increasingly complex world, and our world that seems to be deviating more and more in the direction of the synthetic or artificial intelligence now, we still have these bodies and these biologies that very much govern our lives. We're mostly kind of moved by this creature here, as smart as we think we are. So our bodies are connected with nature. And the closer we are with nature in general, the more happy I've been and the more happy I notice people are and healthy we are. And the more that we deviate from nature, the more complex we make things and eventually come with our tail tucked between our legs and finding our way back. So in my own experience, I went out into the desert and I did the same thing with my phone. And I took my phone, I was looking at the stars, and I was, spending a couple days out camping in the desert. And I'm like, I'm having an experience here with these stars. And I feel like I'm communing with them. But they're not matching up with what the tropical astrology chart says. So in many ways, I had came to the same realization about 5 years ago that you did. And when I started to explore sidereal astrology and then True Sky, I started to realize I'm getting a much different perspective on myself. But I want to hear in your words what the biggest benefit or the biggest shift that happens when you start shifting your viewpoint of astrology from tropical and into True Sky and you start to interpret charts. What changes for you and for the people that you've been doing readings for?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, first of all, I want to say that I still find tropical accurate. Okay. So in astrology, as you know, David, we have what you might call, well, it's not technically called this, but what I like to call derivative charts. Like you've got charts of charts, right? And these are still accurate. Like, for example, like you have your progress chart, which is derived from the natal chart, right? And you can do this and still have a lot of accuracy. This is what I believe tropical is. It's a derivative. And I don't mean that in the way to take away from the, like I said, I still find it very accurate. But it's important to recognize that it's not the actual sky, right? So it's derived from that. And because it's derived from that, it's looking at yourself or your life from a specific lens. Like the progress chart is looking at it from a certain time period. With tropical, it's looking at it from what I feel like is a more physical self. Because if you think about it, they basically with tropical, it's a seasonal system. So for those that don't know, they've fixed the zodiac at the spring equinox. So that means no matter what precession, wobble, stars, whatever, they're going to start the zodiac always at the beginning of spring. And that's 0 degrees Aries, the first sign of the zodiac. So what this is it's basically taking the wheel of life, which I think astrology is one of the expressions of that. I don't think astrology is like the thing. It's just the zodiac is an expression of life, and it's showing us, I think, the cycle of life or the wheel of life. So they've taken this wheel of life and they've overlaid it on top of the seasons. They've overlaid it on top of the seasons. So you're still getting the accuracy because you're still using that cycle of life, but you're fixing it to the seasons. So this would suggest then that what you're saying in the tropical chart is a more physical self, if you think about it. What the Hindus might call more of the karmic chart. Really what you're seeing, in this wheel of karma, this sort of continuous, doesn't change motion. I mean, the whole Earth could spiral out and be flying through space, and that system would still function as that repetitive, structured, ongoing, infinitely chart. So this speaks a lot to that more 3D physical reality that we've created and is, of course, still very important. You could also maybe say it's a little more egocentric too, but not ego in a bad way, just more on the physical self. So it's using the seasonal self or the physical self. And so there's still a lot of accuracy in that. And that's why things like, especially like a good example is like your rising sign in tropical actually does a really good job. In fact, a better job than true sidereal at describing your physical qualities. So if your rising sign is, say, Gemini in tropical, you will see a lot of those more Gemini qualities in your personality that you won't see if, say, your rising sign is Taurus. Now, the rising sign in true sidereal is obviously it's valuable in its own way, and that leads me, I guess, to my point, which is, well, true sidereal, I think, is showing that fundamental self. Okay, you could say it's the more spiritual self. I like to think of it as the more fundamental self because, again, it is the actual sky. I mean, astrology, astro is the sky, and we need to be using that if we're going to be using astrology. You can use tropical astrology so long as we understand that that is, of course, a derivative from the sky being superimposed on the seasons, like I said. So the fundamental self, perhaps the more core self, maybe the spiritual self, is the true sidereal. So that's really what I see in terms of the difference and what works for people too. Like there's plenty in the community that use both tropical and true sidereal, and it works for them, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Others, like myself, just prefer things to be like, hey, I don't want to overcomplicate things. I just want to look at one chart, and this is the chart that I choose to work with. Others, it's just not the time for them. Like I believe everything crosses our path at a certain time. And if your tropical chart is working well for you, it's helping you gain self-awareness. It's helping you with your life experiences. It's helping you interpret things and grow and learn. Like I've grown so much using just tropical astrology, then great. You don't need the true sidereal. But what I do find is that those who do get introduced to true sidereal are on a certain, let's say, stage, not that one's higher or lower than the other, but a certain stage of their journey where they're open to this more, let's say, malleable way of looking at the self, and then starting to look at the self from a different perspective, right? And in that way, I think the true sidereal, obviously the one I use, I do find it to be the most accurate in the sense that it really helps us, I think, the most with things like our life path, things like understanding our spiritual journey more, what we're here to do, still physical in the sense that, like you said, we have this physical body, we're here to embody this energy here, but definitely on that more fundamental level that I think the stars are really trying to communicate. And like you said, when we go outside, I think that is that communication. And it is that bridge there. So that's what I see. So, again, it's just something that I think everyone should be open-minded about, because unfortunately, I don't think the issue is that people are not ready. What I think the issue is that most people think that like their tropical chart is where everything actually is. So if you were to ask someone on the street, like, hey, what's your sun sign? Most of them would know. They say, I think I'm a Taurus. And they would assume that that's where the sun was when they were born. I mean, why wouldn't they, right? Why wouldn't you assume that?
Mhm.
And so my big role here is not so much to like convert people to true sidereal or whatever, but to just give the information that this exists, and that tropical, unfortunately, the main system of the West does not use the actual sky, the visible sky. And so then I leave it up to the individual, of course, then if they're open to it, they want to explore it more. But that's the biggest difference. Yeah, I see it as a more fundamental self, the more fundamental chart. And I think it helps a lot with especially these more personal growth, spiritual life path related questions that those on that stage of their journey are really asking for, or wanting more confirmation on. And thus they can have this tool, which is extremely valuable to help them with that. Not that we need this tool. I don't think we need astrology, but it's a very helpful tool when we need it for that purpose.
There's something you said here that I want to kind of unpack a little bit. You said in tropical astrology, the datum's fixed. So wherever the sun rises on the spring equinox, that point is the beginning goalpost of the zodiac, and then it's 30 degrees after that until it comes around again. And if Earth were to be flying out of the solar system and into a different solar system, we'd still be using that same datum, but the sky would be completely different. And what True Sky does, or True Sidereal, is it's actually creating a communion with the actual stars themselves. So it's always placing the planets in relation to the stars behind there. So intuitively, one system is fixed to the Earth, so it's from the Earth's perspective. The other one is a perspective that is inclusive both of the Earth and the cosmos. So it's almost like a dialogue between us and the cosmos and the universe. So in a way, it puts us in greater communion with a higher intelligence out there, which is, the other planets of our galaxy and stars of our galaxy, sorry. The other thing, though, that's interesting is we actually do have some sort of a distortion mechanism that's called the precession of the equinoxes, right? And we know one of the grandfathers of modern astrology is Ptolemy, right? The Greek astrologer. And in his day, which is about, I think, 300 BC or so, the precession of the equinoxes was at such a position that where the sun rose on the spring equinox was, the 0 degrees Aries in the sky, right? So the goalpost lined up with the stars. So when he's looking at the sky, that's when tropical and sidereal lined up. Now, what's happened is every 72 years after that, we've gone off by a degree. So go fast forward 2,000 years later, and we're off by well over 20 degrees. So as a result of that, now we're not looking at the same sky Ptolemy was. Like there's this wobble that's caused this whole thing. So as a result, what he was saying in his interpretations are different than what we have now, because he's looking at these same goalposts and we're looking at the same goalposts, but the entire landscape has changed.
Yeah, exactly. And Ptolemy was a very well-respected, and still to this day, very well-respected astrologer, astronomer, scientist, and very much wanting to seek the truth, very much like we are today. There's nowhere written, there's no evidence whatsoever that his intention, because like you said, he came up with a simplified system. He said, hey, why are we worrying about this precession? They didn't know it was the wobble, but this precession is changing. Why not just why just fix everything to the seasons? Because like you said, it was matching. At the spring equinox, it was very relatively close at the time of the 0 degrees of Aries. And it is actually the exact point when you use the 30-degree system. And it's the same reason that the Babylonians used their 30-degree system 2,000 years before that, right? So you've got, in a way, a sort of simplification, which does become very helpful, especially when, again, you don't have these computers and very high-tech ways of going in and calculating all this stuff, right? So I think Ptolemy's intentions were good. There's no evidence to suggest that he was intending for that tropical system to go on for another 2,000 years. I think it was all there to sort of standardize astrology at the time, make it simpler. And in very many ways, it made it much easier for the layperson or everyday person to use this stuff. Plus, they were more concerned with using it for timing. Like we're saying with tropical is good for this, but more about calendars and clocks, and especially the Babylonians. I mean, that was their real intention. So, yeah, the question is why have we been using the system for more than 2,000 years? We can go down the rabbit hole. There's conspiracies and all that. I mean, we could think of it as maybe during the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, when the church and whatnot were in high control. The elites were in high control there. It's very possible they were using their version of sidereal or a more true sky version, and maybe giving the tropical to the masses and this kind of a thing. But anyways, without even going there, the point is that yeah, we've still deviated. Yes, tropical is can be used as it's still very accurate, and earth-based is perfect. Like you said, that's a really good way of describing Earth-based system. But we need to be aware of both. Yeah, we definitely need to be aware of both, and we need to be aware of why we're still using that system. Like you said, that Ptolemy, I think his intention, I mean, it's pretty clear his intention was to standardize the system to make it easier. Yeah, and then we can even go back 2,000 years before that and say, okay, the Babylonians, I don't think, so let me explain that. So, the Babylonians, they're the ones that made all the zodiac 30 degrees each. So their intention was to do calendars and clocks, and that's very obvious through the tablets and stuff. So they could have very well been, and I think it was, that the Babylonians were still using the real zodiac for astrology, for, using the stars for storytelling and all this, but using this new even degree, 30 degree zodiac for calendars and clocks. And this is what we have evidence of, is because, well, it was much more mainstream to use the zodiac for, it's more practical. You needed it for gardening, you needed it for travel, you needed it for all this stuff. So that was their calendar and clock, and they simplified the zodiac to be an all even 30 degrees. Was that their intention to use it with astrology? There's no evidence of that. I don't believe that's what their intention was, and they could have very well still been using astrology as the true sky. There's a lot of evidence that actually a lot of Greek astrologers were still using the true sky, which just proves the point that if they were doing it after, then they were likely doing it before too. But anyways, that's when Ophiuchus was removed. And so, we have this 13th sign of Ophiuchus. And, because when you're creating this clock or this calendar, 12 is a very good number, right? It's evenly divisible. You have quarters and everything's just like, we have our clock. Imagine a clock with 13 hours, or even a calendar with 13 months, even though that would make a lot more sense, even because of our lunar cycle, right? Every 13 lunar cycles in a year. But a clock, right? So their intention, I think, was also pure, was to just simplify it and say, okay, we're still considering Ophiuchus, because Ophiuchus is the same part of the sky as Scorpio. And if you look at him, it's wild actually how closely they overlap. So if you use the ecliptic as the reference point, Scorpio and Ophiuchus almost perfectly overlap, which means that they are basically the same energy, just a different octave or different expression of that. So anyways, they removed Ophiuchus to simplify things, but it's still that same energy of Scorpio. But again, I think that was more for practical reasons like calendars and clocks. So here we are, 4,000 years later, rediscovering Ophiuchus and seeing a lot of ancient information of the serpent bear and the meaning of deep serpent. Now we're seeing it in Egypt as well. We see parts of the wall that are actually dedicated to a 13th sign and all this kind of stuff. So rediscovering that, and I'll tell you, David, as you know, it's not easy. Our job is not easy to try to pick up these pieces from things that, date so long ago. But this is the beauty of, and I think this is, what you're alluding to earlier, is I think this is the beauty of what's happening now with humanity, is we are starting to get back to nature. We are starting to get back to our roots. Mm-hmm. And I think all this ancient wisdom and knowledge is surfacing. And I think True Sidereal plays a really big role in that.
Let's talk about Ophiuchus for a minute, because Ophiuchus has some interesting traits that I've seen in my readings. First of all, in True Sidereal Human Design, it's closely affiliated with Gate 1. Gate 1 is the creative, the generative force of let there be light. Like, it's, whenever I see a 1 in somebody's chart, I'm like, if you hold your creativity back, you're going to die, man. Like, that's the power of Gate 1. but it's also quite close. Correct me if I'm mistaken, but it's also close to the galactic center as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so
Exactly. It's right.
that's like a raw broadcasting radio station of pure cosmic pulsations, right? So the energy coming through Ophiuchus because of that vector is massive. And so whenever, I've seen that signature in people, it's like, don't get in their way. If there's suns in Ophiuchus, it's like, you gotta let them be themselves because they're going to be a force to reckon with.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and anyone who's been fortunate enough to get out of the light pollution and can see the Milky Way, that's the center of the galaxy that we're talking about. But everyone's seen it in pictures. It's that really bright band that almost looks like the atmosphere or something, but it's really the center of our galaxy. And there's so much, like you said, there's so much energy, there's so many stars, there's so many clusters in that line between us and the galactic center, and especially in the center of this thing, that it's extremely transformative part of the sky. And we see this with astrology. Every time a planet passes over the galactic center, it really represents the death and the rebirth of that planet. And so, yeah, this is at the very end of Ophiuchus. So the this wheel of life suggests that before you get to this 0 point, right? There's a black hole in the center of the Milky Way. Again, very energetic with all these stars. Before you get to the 0 point, you have to go deep, and that's the Scorpio. You have to go into the deeper world, bring all this stuff to the surface. And then there's Ophiuchus. So after Scorpio crosses the ecliptic, then Ophiuchus crosses the ecliptic at the same spot, but starting before the galactic center. And Ophiuchus is the serpent bearer. And so it's all about working with that scorpionic sort of energy, right? Because Scorpio represents the instincts, it's the deeper, basically the part of the human experience that we've exiled. So if we get into things like Jungian psychology, we start to see that that's the part of the sky, and again, that's what it looks like. That represents the shadow self. So where the ego, the conscious self, has sort of we're the whole enchilada, right? We are the whole spectrum of life within all of us. But once the ego is formed, the conscious self is formed, it starts to have these I am, and it starts to separate from that. But what happens is once you start identifying with certain qualities, like I am this, you're basically implying that you're not something else. And all those not I ams go into the unconscious and what Jung called the shadow. And so these things need an expression, right? Because we need to express the truth of the whole self, right? So these, was what we see in psychology, is that these shadow parts of the self start to manifest unhealthfully, unconsciously, unintentionally, when they're not given the light of day. So Scorpio's job is to bring this stuff to the surface. That's usually it's these more instinctual, primal, darker aspects of self, so to speak. And that comes to the surface of Scorpio. And then Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, the one wielding the serpent, is working with it, right? And this is very clear. If we look at Western mythology, we see a lot of fighting of serpents. The dragon is like the best example of this, constantly battling with the dragon. And this is all very symbolic, again, of that serpent energy. But in this case, the West wants to overcome it and tame it. Or conquer it. And that's all fine and good from a Yang perspective. But, Ophiuchus is showing us that actually we can wield it, we can hold it, we can befriend the dragon. We do see a lot of stories of this, like even with the Hobbit and stuff, of the befriending of the dragon. So this becomes much more empowering, because this is basically the ego now reintegrating with more of the true self. Will never be, of course, the ego will never be can't be fully aware and conscious of the whole self, but it can integrate more of it. And the more of that shadow that we do integrate, that becomes healthfully, intentionally a part of ourselves, the more free we are, the more soul aligned we are, etc., right? The more of our true self. So that's what that part of the sky is really symbolizing. And so what we see is Scorpio brings it up. Then Ophiuchus is, hey, let's work with it. And that's why we see a lot of even doctors, shamans, people like this have this, very deep Ophiuchus energy. But let's work with it. And then that's the transformation. Then once we're done with this, there is an ego death. This is the passing over of the galactic center, and then we emerge out the other side. And what emerges out of the other side is Sagittarius, the free spirit. So the centaur, but that's half horse, the bottom instinctual, right? So the bottom instinctual self is now having been integrated with the self. We're no longer separate from the instinctual. We're part of the instinctual, but in this case, it's represented by a horse because of the freedom and all that comes with it. So anyway, Sagittarius is the free spirit. That's where we have a full moon literally right now as we speak in True Sidereal, at least at the time of this recording on the 10th of July. But this idea of this free spirited energy, the butterfly out of the cocoon, if you will. And that's where we get a lot of the wisdom and knowledge that Sag gives us. But yeah, extremely important. And I've considered many times, like, why don't we actually start the zodiac on the galactic center? I know now more why we don't. But every time you have like a water to an air sign, so Pisces to Aries is the beginning of the zodiac. There's this new energy that emerges. We have the beginning of the zodiac with Aries, but also with Leo, the Cancer Leo. This was seen by the Egyptians as the gateway of the soul. So that's what they believed is where the soul originates and comes from. And then you've got the Ophiuchus to Sagittarius. And all these are extremely transformative, going from the deeper water into then the free spirit of the fire that emerges out of that deep transformation that usually occurs in most water signs, but without a doubt, Ophiuchus. And then we start to question, why was Ophiuchus actually removed, or why was it still removed from so many years? And we could, again, theorize. And why are we removing 13 elevators, the 13th floor from an elevator? And why are we not, why was Jesus Christ or other, similar figures given the number 13? We see 13 is extremely symbolic, and all of them very much linked to that Ophiuchus transformative energy. A great example is, Jesus was the Redeemer. I think that's really what Jesus was about, was redeeming those that society had exiled and, embracing them, loving them unconditionally, and thus, helping humanity as a result transform. Right. But anyways,
wow,
very, very powerful.
We're getting into some deep stuff here, because I think our entire Earth empires, the empires and the civilizations of the Earth, has always been about keeping the masses chasing pleasure and avoiding pain, right? So there's always been this mythology of good versus evil, and the evil's the shadow, and therefore we kill the dragon, we kill the serpent, right, in order to triumph. But it's a fantasy, that's not how reality works. And I think when we pass by the galactic center, it's a reminder of natural law, not man's law. And that in many of the cultures that had deep spiritual traditions, the serpent was seen as the pathway of ascension. In Egypt, of course, it was in India as well, it was the symbolic of the Kundalini energy rising. And I mean, you look at the caduceus it's the two serpents weaving. Many other cultures around the world revered the serpent. It's only really in our Western cultural milieu that we fight the serpent, or we kill it, or is evil. Interesting thing about the Egyptians too is I believe that Egypt was very associated with Orion's belt. The pyramids 13,000 years ago, they lined up with 3 stars in Orion's belt. And of course, the star Sirius, the star system Sirius, is kind of at that cusp of Leo and Cancer, or and so to start the zodiac there, that makes a lot of sense for them, because that was highly associated with their culture. It's fascinating when you look at it from an astronomical perspective, because all this stuff starts to be placed in a completely different light. But I love the way that you describe the mythology there, because Sagittarius very much represents the one who's found the truth, and the one who travels to share the truth, and that truth is born out of the death. I had to die to find that truth. So in many ways, it speaks to the great mystery that Ophiuchus represents. And I guess I just wanted to ask you, every sign has a ruler. And in True Sky, or in True Sidereal, we now have a new sign. So can you speak a little bit about the ruler of Ophiuchus and how that ruler generally gets interpreted or plays out in readings?
Yeah, so me personally, I always come from a more traditional standpoint because that's what's been tried and tested through
Mhm.
time. So even with like, for those that know, like Uranus was only discovered in the late 1700s and just started to get incorporated into astrology after that. And this includes Neptune in the 1800s, Pluto only in 1960, right? So there's a lot of these new planets we've discovered. But astrology dates far, far back before that. So this is what we call using the traditional rulers, not the modern ones. So I'm big into that because these are also the planets that you can see with the naked eye. Everything up to Saturn are the traditional rulers, and here it plays the role in terms of the more physical self, more physical experiences. So it makes sense to start things with the fundamental there. You can use the other modern stuff, and it's great, but we need that again foundation. So then we think, okay, well, what was that part of the sky associated with traditionally? And again, it shares the same part of the sky as Scorpio. So again, if you look at this part of the sky, you will see Scorpio wrapping completely below Ophiuchus. So it makes this is why I don't use 13 houses, by the way. So a lot of people ask, like, why aren't you using 13 houses if you're using 13 signs? And it's because the Scorpio and Ophiuchus share the same part of the sky. Scorpio and Ophiuchus share the eighth part of the sky if you count from the Aries part of the sky. So it's really a dual sign. And
Mm.
so just like any sign, basically, like I said, we are in a wheel of life with astrology. The beginning of a sign is way different from the end of the sign, even though it's the same sign. This is why I like True Sidereal because it treats things more fluidly. We're not going to say like, oh, you're like 0 degrees this, so you're that. We are going to say that, okay, there's this spectrum of life. We're slowly evolving from one state of consciousness to the next. And this is happening in a more spectrum or barometric sort of way than just like, like all like a steps. So here, like I said, Scorpio is the early part of this eighth house energy, this eighth part of the sky energy. Ophiuchus is the later part. And but it's that same energy. And so I use the same traditional rulers for Scorpio as I do for Ophiuchus. So this is water and fixed. So here we're using Mars, okay? Mars traditionally ruling that part of the sky. And I can get into that like, oh, that doesn't sound right. But traditionally, Mars was associated with Scorpio. And the reason is because each planet has a conscious and unconscious expression, all of them except the sun and moon, which are two yin and yangs to themselves. But anyways, Mars' conscious is definitely Aries. So for those that know Mars, it's the god of war, it's assertive, it's masculine energy. And that's very much what Aries is. Aries, the ram, right? Assertive, independent. The Mars, we all agree, rules Aries. And that's because that's Mars's conscious side. But what's Mars's unconscious side? And there's a myth in Greek mythology that explains this very well. And I believe it was, and it's Ares in Greek, but I believe it was Mars. I believe Ares is, I think it was sister, like his younger sister. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but some sort of relative, someone connected like that. The story is that she followed in his wake, and she was the god of destruction and death. And the idea here is that Mars was the god of war. So everywhere Mars went, he would do his war. But then in his wake, there was the destruction and the death. And this is the shadow of Mars. We're talking about the shadow of the self, but every planet has a shadow too. So Mars is consciously out there projecting independence, assertiveness, directness. But in the wake, what happens in the wake of that? If you're completely self-interested like Mars is, what happens in the wake of that? Deeper personal transformation, healing, deep stuff, life, death, these deeper energies that are basically associated with Scorpio and Ophiuchus. So I want to make it very clear that when we say Mars rules Scorpio traditionally or Mars rules Ophiuchus traditionally, it's really the unconscious part of Mars, but that's the planet we look at in the chart. And so when you go to see where Mars is, you're going to read it from that perspective. You're going to read it from the unconscious elements of Mars there. Now, of course, we're in modern times, so we've had a lot of discoveries. That part of the sky is also associated with Pluto. Those that know mainstream astrology, Scorpio is associated with Pluto. We can say the same thing about Ophiuchus, but I would take it one step further there and say that it's Chiron. So for those that know Chiron, the comet, it orbits right in between Saturn and Uranus. And this comet is very much about transformation. And to understand Chiron just for a second, it'll really make sense with Ophiuchus is that Chiron orbits after Saturn. Saturn is the last of the visible planets. What we were talking about earlier about Jungian psychology, if you're going to go into the unconscious, which means trans-Saturn, you want to go to Uranus in your chart, you want to go to Neptune in your chart, you want to go to Pluto in your chart, well, you have to pass through the gatekeeper Chiron. And Chiron is really the healer, but in this analogy, it's the shadow work. In order to go into the unconscious, you have to heal and you have to do the shadow work. And this is what Chiron represents in the chart. So I 100% am with all modern true siderealists that look at Chiron as the ruler of Ophiuchus, and there's a much more direct link there between that and, let's say, Mars. But again, I still definitely recommend using the traditional ruler as the base. Once we look at that in the chart, then we can go into these more unseen forces, like in this case, Chiron, and get more deeper understanding. So yeah, if you want to know about how Ophiuchus operates in your chart, look to see where Ophiuchus, the healer, is, and Chiron, the wounded healer. There's a whole bunch of mythology there too, but the wounded healer, to see where you can heal and transform in order to empower yourself or do that transformative stuff, that Ophiuchus is guiding you to do.
That was a beautiful answer, by the way. That whole thing, really, that was extremely well articulated, and I love that you tied in both the traditional interpretation and brought in the mythology of Eris in there, and also spoke into the role that Chiron plays, and also in a light that really gives a much deeper perspective to it. A lot of people go through their Chiron return between the age of 50 and 52. And, when I'm doing readings for people or to see that time in their life, I tend to attract a lot of people that are basically faced with a pattern that has been unconscious for a long time, but played out in their lives and is now coming to a head. And so they find themselves at a catalytic moment. So if you're listening to this and you're between the age of 50 and 52, it's time to do some shadow work, folks. If you haven't already. The earlier you do it in life, the better, and then it doesn't have to come to a head like that. It probably still will in some way, but thank you for that. I guess another question I have is, how do you reconcile the fact that you now have a massively increased arc length of Virgo? So, Virgo is going to be weighted way more than, let's say, Libra in the chart. So, all of a sudden somebody looks at their chart and, I'm joking here, but people are like, no one likes Virgo in astrology. And then all of a sudden they used to be Libra and now they've got, 8 planets at Virgo and they're screaming. How do you reconcile that some of these signs are now much, much larger?
Yeah. So, well, we have that cycle of life, and certain constellations take longer to integrate. Virgo is not an easy to integrate sign, and it takes a lot of time. So if we think about this in terms of transits, let's say with the fastest transits, which is of the moon, it takes us longer to integrate Virgo energy. So, this is what our ancestors believed anyways, those that, said that this is the maiden, this is what this symbolizes, this very large part of the sky. And I totally agree with that. Pisces is another very large one, and it takes a lot of time to integrate that energy as well. So, so we can look at it that way. We can look at it as, okay, this is something that, takes more time to integrate. We can also look at it collectively, and we can say that actually, if, like you were saying, if let's say everyone was born equally, at the same time of the year equally and all this, then we're going to have more Virgos. We're going to have a lot more Virgos, right? But if you think, once you look at the zodiac this way, it becomes very interesting, because then you start to see, okay, well, Virgo is a large constellation. Something like Aries is a much smaller constellation, much smaller. So we need more Virgo energy in the world than we do Aries energy. So for those that don't know, Virgo is like the worker. Basically, it's labor. And like you said, not too many people are jumping for joy when they find out they're a Virgo. Virgo is an awesome constellation. I have the most respect for Virgo Pisces axes there. But, it's associated with that hard work. It's associated with personal development, improvement, work on a physical collective level. It's labor, it's hard work. It's, doing the repetitive tasks, the mundane. It's building systems and structures that work, being a part of those business buildings or systems and structures. And so we need more of those individuals right? Or at least we need to collectively work on that the most. And we may need that the most in order to have a balanced Earth. Whereas Aries, like I said, it's like more assertive, more independent. Do we need now? Look, if Aries was so large, if Aries was as large as Virgo, think of the world we would be living in. We'd be living in like a bunch of people being extremely assertive, extremely direct, a bunch of warriors. Maybe that was the time during the age of Aries, which was the Roman Empire, by the way. But in today's world, generally kind of general world, and we are in the age of Pisces, by the way, which is actually the time of Virgo. We've been in this since basically the time of Ptolemy, we technically 500 years before that, some more Socrates. But this idea that actually we're all supposed to be integrating Virgo energy right now because that's the fall. That's the fall equinox, right? So that's the energy that we're balancing out with the Pisces. So Pisces collectively, we're all here to cultivate more spirituality right now. That's actually what we're here to do, humanity-wise. But right now, being that we have that Virgo energy to balance it with, we're still since that time working. I mean, very laborious. I mean, it's been definitely a time of peak because that represents more of the kind of that higher energy, but this peaking of that Virgo energy. So right now we definitely need it more than ever, but even regardless of whatever the age it is that we're in, you can see that, humanity very clearly needs more, let's say, workers than they do warriors, which is symbolic by the size of these constellations. So I think the question is why did our ancestors actually choose to make it so large, right? Because honestly, these are just stars. You can just look at these stars and does Virgo have to be a maiden? No, honestly, you could look at Virgo and it's not like a maiden sticks out. It's like a cloud, and like you can definitely interpret it any way you want. Virgo could be, a sheep, I don't know, something else, another human. Why is it a virgin? Why is it this symbolic thing? And that's because our ancestors saw that. I believe it's because our ancestors saw that when planets went into those constellations at certain times, certain things started to happen. And when things were going into Virgo, we had that work energy, we had that improvement energy, we had that detailed energy. So they decided this way. And so then I guess the question is like, why did they choose it that way? But in my experience, it gave you two examples as to why, but I also see it, of course, reflected in individuals. It's harder to, and maybe not necessarily harder, not necessarily harder, but it takes longer. Okay. It takes more intention. It takes longer to integrate. And it's also, perhaps we need more of that kind of energy in the world when you think of all those that have more Virgo than some of those smaller constellations.
Wow. In all my years of astrology, I've never heard an answer like that, but that makes a lot of sense. Perhaps we need it. And that energy takes longer to integrate. Aries is fast. Aries is a sprint, as we know. So thank you for that. I guess the last thing I want to end on, because I hear this a lot from people, is now I've got two charts. I've got the tropical chart and I've got this one. What am I? I think people are so in need of an identity. And it's also very difficult for many people to reconcile the fact that they can be multidimensional. They can have different lenses into their multidimensional nature, right? So how do you help people, or what do you say to people when they're very attached to, or they're very fixed to their tropical astrology chart, but they're also showing an interest in true sidereal?
Well, like I was saying before, I just tell them about it. And then, like you said, I have the chart calculator on the website. So I say, hey, just go check it out and see if it resonates, And it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't resonate for everybody at the time that they come across it. But most of the time it does. I do believe that, like, if you're listening to this and you're not already into true sidereal, or, you stumble upon my website or some of David's stuff, like, I believe that it's the time for that. Like, there's a reason why that's crossing your path. And I'm not saying there's a time to do it, but there's a time there's a reason it's crossing your path. And so it's there to either glean something from it, or just maybe look at it from just be exposed to it once now and then maybe again later, whatever it is. But the more open-minded we are to everything, right? Like, I know what tropical is. I spend my time with tropical. Thankfully for that, I can now, explore something else. But the more open, maybe if there's something, maybe there's a new type of astrology that just, and there is, I have people in the community, I'm sure you do too, that are coming up with like new and innovative ways of doing true sidereal, or they're coming up with new and different systems. And so it's very important to be open-minded for all of us in order to grow and develop. We definitely do not want to be having the blinders on and just being stuck in like one thing of anything, even if it's even if it's true sidereal for me, like whatever the best. So I hope, that, I always try to promote open-mindedness, and I try to promote the importance of being open-minded. But again, all I really do is I just say, look, like if you're open to this, and I hope you are, or, I hope you're open in general, then just go check it out. Go to the websites, type in your birth details, and there's even a small mini report underneath that tells you a little bit about yourself based on this true sidereal. See if it resonates, see if it fits. But I can guarantee you that if you are, full-blown tropical, wearing that armor, you got the sword and shield, well then, nothing, even the truth would deter you. So I just think it is very important for everyone to, keep the shield up, yes, but be open to tasting and experiencing just a little bit of different ideas in order to see how it tastes, to see how it works, and to learn a little bit about it. And that just makes you a more well-rounded individual. I say this for people who are just not even into astrology at all, like I was before. I think there's so many that just discount astrology because it doesn't fit with the scientific framework, and it's been laughed at by the so-called scientists now for thousands of years. But again, if it wasn't for me or anybody being a little bit open-minded and stepping out, because we're not taught astrology at school, we're not taught this stuff usually. So anyone who's even into astrology has that open mind a little bit, unless you're totally indoctrinated into it, which I guess is also possible if you had family or whatever. But anyways, for everything in life, it's important to be open-minded. And so in that case, I just say, with an open mind, go check it out and see if it resonates. And that's it. Cool. I don't need to, convert anyone. I think we're heading in this direction anyways, like you were saying. Humanity's on that trajectory. I do hope it happens sooner than later. But really, what I found is much better to give people that freedom, because in many ways, when I first started, when I was really like, oh man, this is the most amazing thing in the world, and I was much more like pushy, let's say, about it, and that didn't serve very well. That didn't serve very well. So I try as much as it's hard not to when you're passionate about something, but I try in my life to just give people as much of course, autonomy and free will as possible, and all I can do is just share my perspective, and I just hope that by sharing my perspective, some people, or at the right time, etc., they can benefit from something that I think is very important.
Okay. Actually, there is one more question here. Thank you for that answer, by the way. And I like the open-mindedness around that. But I did have a request for a question, and this one's very contentious because
all right.
It has to deal with someone we both know as well, because in a human design, and when you're using genetic matrix, you have to assign an SVP value in order to get, an accurate tracking for this precession of the equinox offset. And previously, the SVP value was set at 31.5 for the year 1968. But I understand that there's been an update in your calculations recently to that. And so that does change these calculations. And I'm just wondering, is that value from 31.5 for 1968 still valid, or can you speak into maybe what you've discovered in your own calculations?
Yeah, so this comes at a very, very important time, because I'm literally about to, probably next week, come up with a standardized version of True Sidereal, because as you can see, there's no objective place that the constellations start and end. Like I say, with the midpoint method is as close as we can get to that. You can't go and look at the sky and be like, oh, this is definitely where Aries starts and then where Pisces ends or whatever. So anyways, I'm standardizing it. Okay, so I don't want to spoil it here, but I will definitely give you the link once it's out, and it might be about around the same time as this releasing. I'm not sure, but in a week or two, I'm going to have this fully published with the exact values and the exact boundaries. I will say this, though, is that there's nothing wrong with continuing to use the system we've been using, because as I've been saying before, 3 degrees of variance and I know it's hard. Here's the tricky thing with human design and gene keys is I know you guys need that exact value because the whole system starts at that point, and one little change can really throw off a lot of the HD and gene key stuff. So this is one of the reasons why I've decided to standardize. So it's something that obviously anyone can choose to use, but it's much more standardized as a lot of you will see once it's published. The system. So I'll say this, there's nothing wrong with using the existing system that we're all using. Like I said, I've been using it for 13 years and it's been extremely accurate. We just need those 3 degrees of variance. But once we do standardize, once I release these standard versions and we're all using them, it's still important to use the 3 degrees of variance, but it's going to be that exact boundary that systems like HD can use will be to the exact, really, 4 decimal places of degrees, which is very, very precise and going to be very helpful for the HD community. So you caught me at an awkward time, David. I'm literally like in the process. I'm writing the article now, actually. It's exactly what I was doing before we talked, but I just came up with the standard values, writing the article. And I hope that I still have to wait for Prometheus. The astrology software I use, I need to get an installer from the developer so that everyone using Prometheus, the astrology software, can update automatically. But it's looking like next week if everything goes well. So I'll send you that link right away. And if depending on when
that'll be in the description,
be
100%. Because
okay.
I think there's people that are really excited to get this. And I think there's even been a couple of people that have maybe been trying their own calculations, because I've seen some variations on that initial model circulating around. So very cool. I look forward to that article 100%. And then right now, I just kind of want to open it up to you and just say, like, people are probably listening to this right now and fascinated by the things you've been saying. People who may have heard of True Sky, or people who are, maybe wanting to know what's next after their tropical reading. So what do you have to offer these people that have listened to this podcast and might want to take the next step with you?
Yeah, so same thing. There's a free chart calculator on the website. You go there. You don't even need your time of birth, although if you do have it, it's extremely valuable because it'll get even more precise. But just your date and not even location, just your date, really, your date of birth, and you'll get your chart. If you have the time and location, even better. But like I said, below that is an interpretation, a mini report that you can see how that resonates. If you're already into tropical or other systems, you'll see how it's different. But it's going to tell you, a quick snippet of your personality, some of your life experiences, things of this nature. If that resonates, then you go to the next step, which is to get the report. And like we talked about before, I'm very happy to give your audience a 50% discount on this report. So that link will be down below in the description. But I'll mention it here. I'll just put it in the description because we might do a different link there. But so 50% off the report to get the full printout. So that's going to be like all of your aspects, your house placements, your sign placements. It's, it was a 15 pages report of the whole thing. But either way, on the website, there's videos, there's courses. I do weekly horoscopes. We have a newsletter. There's a software. So basically anything true sidereal related, we have it right there on the website. So do check it out. It's masteringthezodiac.com, or you can just Google Mastering the Zodiac and check out that chart calculator, because that really is the best first step, because you'll see how that resonates, if it resonates or not, and what this, most importantly, what did the sky actually look like when you were born?
Wow, that's very cool. And thank you very much for the 50% off those full reports. I'm sure people will be jumping over that. And anyone listening too, we talked about Chiron on the show. I've got a really cool free tool. It will calculate your Chiron placement in true sidereal human design and interpret it with the gene keys. So you can actually begin to unpack what I call the collective wound, or the shadow that you carry. And you can see the shadow frequency of it, the gift frequency of it, and the transcendent frequency of this. And a lot of people have taken this free report, and there's a 3-day program or process to begin working with that shadow energy. And they've got a lot of value out of it. It's completely free. The link is in the description below. I'm also running a workshop on working with my trifecta system. For the first time ever, I'm going to actually start showing people how I use it as a diagnostic tool for imbalances in the higher self, and really aligning with that hologram of who you truly are, your true essence, which draws upon Athen's work because it is true sidereal, but we tie together astrology, human design, and the gene keys. So it's been a massive pleasure. This has been really a groundbreaking interview. I've been looking forward to this for months. I booked this in 2 months ago, and I guess the timing was perfect with this release of the article. So whenever that comes out, if this podcast comes out first, I will update it with the link below. So do come back and check it out. But if you do see the link to the article down there, you're in luck. It's published, and now we have even more accurate data. And it doesn't make your old stuff wrong. Think of this as an evolution and an initiation into an even more precise interpretation of your astrology, your human design, or your gene keys.
Yeah, exactly. And everything's still within that 3 degrees of variance. So if you were on the cusp between two things, you should have been reading it as a blend of both anyways. And this new system's not going to change that. It's just going to make it more precise for those that need it more precise, such as the HD community.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, David. It's such a pleasure to be here and had a really good conversation with you.
Absolutely. All right. Take care.